The image of gathering by the river is deeply rooted in cultures all over the world. Humans naturally gather at riverbanks, for there is water to drink and bathe in, and we can wash our clothes. A friend of mine in Japan remembered his mother doing the wash in the river. All through his childhood, it was a joy in the summer and cold and dangerous in the winter. In many cultures, a river lies between this life and the next. When someone of the Pure Land sect of Buddhism dies and is dressed for burial, paper money is put in their pocket to pay the boatman for passage across the river to paradise. Escaping slaves on the arduous trip to freedom left the riverbanks and waded in the streams and rivers to keep the hunting dogs off their scent. Rivers can also be dangerous places. Those of you who have lived near or on rivers remember the deaths by drowning each year. Rivers are life-giving and life-taking. Many of our ancestors gathered at rivers to be baptized. My ancestor, Patty, the grandmother of the woman who told the story to me, was baptized in the Bear River in western Maine. At the time and place of her baptism, she was committing a radical act. I imagine that the water of the Bear River was very cold, and that her heart and mind were full of dreams of a new kind of life. She had already lost 4 of her 8 children to a cholera epidemic and other diseases. And in one scene of her son's diary, she was so sick that she didn't even know that her children were dying in the next room. Entering those waters was a way for her to begin again in a new life that eventually brought her right to this valley. And her act of baptism began a tradition that I followed over 100 years later in a far-off land, my father walking with me ever farther out into the sea until it was up to his waist and he knew that my foot would not rise above the water, and he baptized me. Japan is a land of rivers that rush down from the mountains to the sea. Rivers were traditionally where people threw their garbage, both physical and psychological. One of the friends we had from our first day in Japan, Ayako, taught us an important ritual during our long friendship, which lasts to this day. Lots of things have come up. We had grown up in very different cultures. We spoke different languages, and our experiences with Japanese culture were very different. And in the middle of a misunderstanding that really had no resolution, she suggested, "Kawa ni nagashimashou." Let's throw it all in the river. And we did. And we learned to do that over and over again. Rivers were places where we learned to begin again. Sometimes when Lou and I walked on the river, we carried great imaginary bags of stuff. And we threw them, we heaved them into the river. We walked to the river heavily laden, and on the way back our steps were lighter. Next door to the seminary I attended, Earlham School of Religion, was a kind of sister seminary called Bethany. It was a seminary that was owned and operated by the Church of the Brethren, a denomination similar to the Amish and Mennonites that was born out of the Anabaptist tradition of the Reformation. And during that time, in their beginnings in the 16th century, entering the waters of baptism was a radical act that could lead to torture and death, Baptism is central to their faith. And when I studied ritual at that seminary as a student, our teacher from Bethany Seminary and a member of the Church of the Brethren Faith taught us how to baptize. One January, she spent an entire week teaching us about baptism. She asked me, for some reason, to do the morning devotional on the day we traveled to this small rural town in Indiana to do baptisms. It was a cold day. And knowing that many of my fellow seminary students came from families with roots in the martyrdoms of the Reformation, I thought of how their walk to the river had been full of danger. The path before their own walk to baptism was covered in blood. In the devotional I wrote, we walked that path in reverence to those who gave their lives. The Quakers, as you may imagine, do not practice baptism, or at least that is what I thought, until I met a Quaker mystic who was visiting our seminary. I had a chance to sit with him alone for an hour, and he told me that all the rituals were enacted silently in the minds of the people who attended their community. He reminded me that one part of Jesus' baptism, he reminded me of a part I had forgotten. The part when a voice came from heaven and said, "Behold, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." He said baptism is a confirmation of being loved. So instead of thinking that the ritual was washing away sinfulness, I wondered how marvelous it would be if it were an affirmation of love. For I was alone at that seminary, and that is what I needed. You know, we Unitarian Universalists do not have a ritual of baptism, although there may be some who do that here. When someone wants to join our congregation, they sign a book that contains the signatures of all the others who have joined our community from the beginning of this community. And recently in my office, I stood while some new members of this congregation signed the book. It was a private time of welcoming and joy that we will celebrate during our service next week. What does it mean to become a member of this congregation? At the core of our belief is an articulation of shared ministry made in 1648 by Puritan pilgrims at the Cambridge Platform Covenant. This is what they wrote. "We pledge to walk together in the spirit of mutual love. The spirit of love is alone worthy of our ultimate, our religious loyalty. That covenant calls us to pledge to live together, walk together freely in the spirit of love." The concept of the Cambridge Platform is core to what it means to become a member of this Unitarian Universalist congregation. In many other churches, preparation for joining is learning the beliefs of that denomination and pledging one's own alignment with those beliefs. When I belonged to the denomination of my childhood and my ancestors, the beliefs that I had held since childhood and through baptism began to change. I found myself increasingly uncomfortable and at odds with conforming my own beliefs to the established beliefs. And finally, to save my personal integrity, and I felt at the time I was actually saving my life, I had to admit that I no longer believed. And losing belief meant that I had to leave that community. Many years passed between the time that I left that community and I found Unitarian Universalism. My personal belief tentatively grew during years of study of other religions and from my time in nature. I began to long to meet together with people not who shared my belief, but who were also searching. I wanted to find people with whom I could share a community in mutual respect of a variety of beliefs. And when I walked over to sign the book of the first UU congregation that I joined, I was afraid. There was no blood on the path, but I was blazing a trail, cutting through the jungle with a machete, leaving what had become family tradition, doing something that my extended family had difficulty understanding. I was afraid, but I knew that it was the kind of fear I had when I did something hard that I needed to do. For many, joining our community is a radical act that would cause a silence to descend on the dinner table when one tells one's family. Out in the world, Unitarian Universalism is widely misunderstood. I think that our not having a creed makes people feel uncomfortable, but that's just a guess. In order to understand Unitarian Universalism, you have to think about religion in a new way. When people say, and I hear this often, that we Unitarian Universalists don't believe anything, I explain that we are a community that protects the free and responsible search for meaning. We embark on our religious journey as scientists are taught to enter experiments. They're taught not to know what the final answer is. They're taught to judge from the evidence without preconceptions. And just as in science, that way of searching can lead to radical conclusions. In interfaith work, there used to be a movement towards looking for all the ways we were similar to one another. Recently, however, the trend is to understand how faiths are different from one another and to respect those differences. Our way of being in community with each other, our way of respecting each other, teaches us how to be in the world. For even when we appear similar on paper, we speak the same language, we have the same nationality sometimes, we're even a similar age sometimes, or sexuality, or we're originally from the same church, often we still have had completely different experiences. I remember saying to someone once, out of an assumption that their experience was like mine, "Oh, it must have been really difficult coming out." And she looked up at me and said, "Not really. My family was accepting from the beginning." Our human desire for commonalities gets in the way of seeing people as they are, and I believe it gets in the way of deepening our community. What if we took my great-grandmother's advice and listened? We have begun a new kind of listening this year with our small group ministry branches. It is based on the style of listening and speaking done in Quaker services. During the time someone is sharing, we simply listen. We don't react. We don't do those warm, fuzzy things that we love to do, like nodding and going, hmm. We just listen. And in the process, something quite radical emerges. We feel whole and that we have been heard. And I think those feelings are at the core of the feeling of being loved. As Unitarian Universalists, community building through a love that listens deeply to and celebrates the autonomy and differences of others is a practice of transformation. It helps us, it leads to leaving this earth more evolved than how we entered it. As we accompany each other from childhood to adulthood, through parenthood or not, through coming out or not, through illnesses into death, we do share that part. All of those times, sharing those times, offer us endless opportunities to grow as individuals and together, to reach the end of our lives with light, with karma wrapped around us like a cloak, as the Buddha said. But to do this work, we also need the river. We need a way to begin again when resolution is not in sight. We need a place to release our troubles, to find refreshment, and to get to the work of fording rivers and building bridges over them. Next week, we will welcome new members into our community. And when we do so, let us remember our own beginnings. For those of you who recently signed our book to become members, those of you who are considering doing so, and those of you who did this act long ago, I invite you to spend time meditating on what our sojourn together means to this world. Next week, may our minds be full of memories of the picnic by the marvelous hospitality team, and that begins in only 1 hour. We will have memories of delicious food and dogs in costume and good conversation. And let us find a river for new beginnings, and let us always walk in love. And if you would like to sign the book, if you are considering this, I invite you to contact me and we will talk and perhaps celebrate. May it be so. Amen.